Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartfelt tales that touch the soul and inspire reflection. Today, we bring you the emotional journey of a woman who faced betrayal, resilience, and the transformative power of love and forgiveness. Catherine's life takes an unexpected turn when a figure from her past reappears, forcing her to confront old wounds and make choices for her daughter's future. This story explores the strength of family bonds, the pain of redemption, and the hope of new beginnings. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join us as we unravel this deeply moving narrative. Let's begin today's story. The hospital room buzzed with the hum of fluorescent lights, their cold glow barely cutting through the tension in the air. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious to the life-altering moment unfolding within. Nurses hurried past the open door, their sneakers squeaking softly on polished floors, while the distant chime of an intercom announced yet another patient's name. Inside the delivery room, time seemed to slow. The sounds of the bustling hospital muffled as Catherine Miller's labored breathing filled the space. Her husband, John, gripped her hand tightly, his usually confident demeanor shaken. The sleeves of his designer shirt were rolled up to his elbows, and his meticulously combed hair now clung damply to his forehead. "Breathe, Catherine," he whispered, his voice wavering. His other hand brushed strands of sweat-soaked hair from her face, but the worry etched into his features betrayed his attempts to remain calm. Catherine let out a groan as another contraction rippled through her body. I can't," she gasped, her voice trembling under the weight of exhaustion. "Yes, you can," John urged, leaning closer. "You're strong. You're almost there." Dr. Taylor, the calm and efficient obstetrician, stood at the foot of the bed, her tone steady as she instructed Catherine through the final moments. "One more push. Catherine, you've got this." Catherine summoned every ounce of strength left within her, her cry of effort cutting through the air. And then, as if the universe held its breath, a baby's piercing wail shattered the silence. "It's a girl," the nurse announced, lifting the newborn into view. John's chest swelled with relief, his eyes shimmering as he gazed at the tiny figure wriggling in the nurse's hands. "Annie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Tears prickled his eyes as he saw his daughter for the first time. But before the moment could fully settle, Dr. Taylor's voice broke through. "Wait," she said, her focus sharpening. "There's another." The room buzzed with renewed urgency. Another contraction overtook Catherine, her body trembling with exhaustion. John's hand was crushed in her grip as she pushed again. Seconds later, the second baby arrived, her cries mingling with her sister's. But when the nurse lifted the newborn into view, the room fell into an uneasy silence. John's elation faltered as his gaze landed on the second child. The baby's skin was a warm, rich brown, a striking contrast to the pale complexion of her sister. His smile wavered, confusion clouding his features. He didn't say anything, but the nurse's hesitant glance between him and Catherine was enough to speak the unspoken. Catherine, too weary to react immediately, reached out weakly for her daughters, her voice hoarse. "Let me see them." Before the nurse could comply, the door to the delivery room swung open, and Margaret Miller strode in. Her heels clacked sharply against the tiled floor, her presence commanding and severe. "What is this?" she hissed, her gaze snapping to the darker-skinned baby, her face twisted in disbelief. Then fury. "What is the meaning of this? Mother?" "Not now," John muttered, his tone strained as he glanced toward Catherine, who lay helpless in the bed. Margaret, however, was relentless. She pointed a trembling finger at the newborn in the nurse's arms. "That child is not yours," she declared, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Catherine, what have you done?" Catherine's lips quivered as she struggled to sit up, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "This is your granddaughter," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "Both of them are." Margaret laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. "You expect me to believe that? Look at her." She turned to John, her eyes flashing with anger. You cannot let this stand. John, do you understand what people will say? What this will do to our family's name? John was silent, his gaze shifting between the babies, Catherine, and his mother. The joy that had filled him moments ago was now eclipsed by confusion, doubt, and a growing sense of dread. He felt his mother's hand grip his arm, her nails digging into his skin. Do what is right for this family, she urged in a low, venomous tone. Send her away. Both of them. Catherine's tear-filled eyes locked onto John's, silently pleading. Please. John, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. Don't let her do this. For a moment, time seemed to stop. John's chest tightened, and a lump rose in his throat. He wanted to defend her, to shield her from his mother's wrath. But Margaret's words echoed in his mind. The family name, the reputation, the whispers of judgment that would follow them everywhere. He reached into his pocket, his fingers trembling as they closed around a gold necklace he had designed for Catherine on their anniversary. Pulling it out, he pressed it into her hand, his voice barely audible. Take this, he said hoarsely. Please, take care of her. Catherine's tears fell freely as she clutched the necklace. Her gaze lingered on John for a long, heart-wrenching moment before she turned away, cradling the darker-skinned baby against her chest. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving a silence heavier than any argument. John sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Annie's soft cries filled the room, a haunting reminder of what remained and what had been lost. Margaret stood tall beside him, her expression triumphant. But John felt only the crushing weight of regret. That night, as the lights in the hospital dimmed and the world outside carried on, a man sat broken in the quiet of his choices. What had once been a moment of joy and new beginnings now felt like a scar that would never heal. Somewhere, Catherine walked out into the cold night with her daughter, carrying not only the child but the unbearable burden of betrayal. And in the quiet of his heart, John knew he had made the gravest mistake of his life. The icy chill of the Vermont spring crept into every corner of the small house as Catherine Miller moved methodically through the kitchen. The peeling white paint on the walls bore silent witness to the struggles of a woman who had left behind a life of luxury for this modest refuge. In the bassinet nearby, her daughter Lila stirred, her soft cries breaking the oppressive silence. Catherine paused, her hand trembling as she tucked a worn blanket around Lila. The weight of the gold necklace in her pocket felt heavier than the small suitcase she was packing. It was the only remnant of the life she'd once thought would last forever. She glanced at her reflection in the cracked kitchen window, the woman staring back at her a far cry from the poised and confident Catherine who had once graced charity galas on John's arm. Is this what you wanted? John, she murmured to the empty room, her voice low and filled with quiet accusation. The memory of his voice as he handed her the necklace haunted her, the faint crack in his words betraying his regret even as he capitulated to his mother's demands. Catherine shook her head, her resolve hardening. This was her life now, and she had to move forward for Lila's sake. Every packed bundle of baby clothes, every frayed book she slid into the suitcase, was a piece of the life she was determined to build for her daughter. It didn't matter that the world would judge them. She would teach Lila to stand tall, to see her difference as strength rather than shame. Lila's cries softened as Catherine scooped her up, holding her close. It's just us now. My sweet girl, she whispered, pressing a kiss to the baby's soft curls. But we'll be okay. I promise. The town of Middlebury offered little in the way of excitement or opportunity. But it was quiet, a place where Catherine could disappear. The locals were polite but distant, their curious glances lingering a beat too long when Catherine and Lila passed by. At the diner where she worked mornings, the regulars rarely tipped more than a few crumpled bills. But Catherine didn't mind. Every dollar went toward Lila's future. Her evenings were spent at a small grocery store, her body aching as she lugged boxes and stocked shelves. The customers there were no kinder than those at the diner. Women in tailored coats exchanged whispers when Catherine rang up their orders, their eyes flicking briefly to Lila. The old man at the hardware store across the street often stared too long, his gaze lingering on Lila as though she were an oddity he couldn't quite place. Catherine noticed it all, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she walked with her head high, her steps purposeful, determined not to let the stares and murmurs chip away at her resolve. The nights, however, were harder. When the world was quiet, and Lila was asleep in her bassinet, Catherine would let the weight of her choices press down on her. She would cry, not because she regretted leaving, never that, but because she hated that Lila might grow up in a world that saw her as less than whole. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the town's rolling hills, Catherine sat on the porch with Lila cradled in her arms. The old, leaning clapboard house groaned softly in the breeze. Lila's tiny fingers reached for the necklace Catherine always wore, tugging at the delicate chain. The sight of her daughter's curious expression filled Catherine with both pride and a pang of sorrow. "Mama," Lila said, her voice still unsteady with the innocence of a toddler. "Why do people look at me funny?" Catherine's heart ached at the question, her breath catching. She looked into Lila's wide, dark eyes, so full of trust and curiosity. How could she explain prejudice to someone so young? Someone who saw the world through such pure, unclouded eyes? She shifted Lila onto her lap and brushed a curl from her forehead. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different. It doesn't mean you're bad, or that they're right. It just means they don't know how special you are." Lila tilted her head, her small face scrunching in thought. "Special," she echoed, her tone curious. Catherine smiled, nodding. "Different doesn't mean bad. It means you're strong. You and we're like this house." She gestured to the weathered porch beneath them. "It might not look like much to some people, but it's strong. It keeps us safe." Lila giggled, leaning her head against her mother's chest. "I'm strong like the house," she exclaimed, her voice bright. Catherine laughed softly, wrapping her arms tighter around her daughter. "Stronger," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. That night, as she tucked Lila into bed, Catherine placed the gold necklace into her tiny hand for the first time. "This is a piece of your story," she said quietly, brushing Lila's hair back. "One day, you'll understand how special it makes you." Lila's fingers closed around the pendant as her eyes fluttered shut. Watching her, Catherine felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their life wasn't perfect, and the world might not always be kind, but she would ensure that Lila grew up knowing her worth. "Different doesn't mean broken," Catherine whispered to herself as she stood by the window, looking out at the silent town. "And I'll make sure she knows it every single day." In that moment, as the stars began to dot the Vermont sky, Catherine resolved to build a life of strength and love for her daughter. No matter how small the house or how narrow the world seemed, it would be enough because it was theirs. The Anderson mansion loomed like a relic from another era. Its grand facade, with towering columns and perfectly manicured gardens, was a testament to the wealth and legacy that defined the Miller family. But within those walls, the air was thick with unspoken regrets and hollow routines. John Miller sat alone at the head of the expansive dining table. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. The sprawling mansion, which had once felt like a fortress of security, now felt suffocating, a cold, echoing void that magnified his solitude. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass absent-mindedly, the weight of his choices pressing against him like a vice. His daughter, Emma, sat across the table, her posture perfect, her manners impeccable. She was every inch the product of Margaret's rigorous upbringing. Emma had inherited her grandmother's sense of discipline and poise but had never quite understood the unyielding coldness that accompanied it. Tonight, however, her usual air of composure was tinged with frustration. "Dad," Emma said, breaking the silence, Why don't you ever talk about Mom? Or anything? John looked up sharply, her words catching him off guard. He adjusted his tie, a nervous habit that gave away the discomfort he tried so hard to mask. Emma. It's not that simple, he replied, his voice low. It's been years, she pressed, leaning forward. You never tell me anything about her. I don't even know what she was like. Her voice softened, but the sadness in her tone was unmistakable. How am I supposed to understand my own family when you and Grandma refuse to talk about it? John flinched at her words. He had always avoided these conversations, unwilling to confront the ghosts of his past. His silence, meant to shield Emma from his pain, had instead created a chasm between them. He sighed deeply, his gaze dropping to the table. Emma, I don't know where to start. Before Emma could respond, Margaret's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. That's enough. Emma. Both father and daughter turned to see Margaret entering the room, her presence as imposing as ever. She carried herself with the kind of authority that brooked no dissent. Her gaze lingered on Emma, her expression disapproving. Your father has enough on his plate without you dredging up the past. Margaret continued, her voice firm. Focus on your studies and your future. That's what matters. Emma clenched her jaw, but she didn't argue. Margaret's word was law in the Miller household, and even Emma, with her fiery spirit, rarely dared to challenge it. John remained silent, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of his mother's dominance. Margaret turned her attention to John, her tone softening but her control still evident. You've done well to keep the family's affairs in order, John. We don't need to dwell on things that no longer matter. But they did matter. They mattered more than Margaret would ever admit. And John knew it. His silence had been a shield, but now it felt like a prison. The echoes of Catherine's tearful departure haunted him daily, and the absence of Lila, the daughter he had failed to protect, gnawed at his soul. Yet Margaret's influence was so deeply ingrained that even now, he struggled to defy her. After dinner, John retreated to his study, his sanctuary within the mansion. The room smelled of aged leather and faint cigar smoke, a testament to the countless hours he spent there, buried in work to avoid his thoughts. Tonight, however, he couldn't escape them. The gold necklace Catherine had left with was seared into his memory, a reminder of all he had lost. His eyes fell on the collection of family records spread across his desk. Yellowed documents and faded photographs chronicled generations of the Miller lineage, a legacy Margaret had always held sacred. Among the papers, he found an old letter penned by his great-grandfather. The ink was faint, but the words were clear. The world may judge us harshly for what they cannot understand. But love, true love, transcends the boundaries of race, class, and prejudice. It is not defined by the narrow minds of society but by the strength of those who dare to defy it. The letter struck John like a lightning bolt. His great-grandfather had written these words in defense of his wife, a woman of mixed heritage whose story had been buried by the family's relentless pursuit of perfection. The irony was cruel. The very legacy Margaret had sought to preserve was rooted in the same truth she had tried to erase. John leaned back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. His thoughts raced back to Catherine and Lila, to the child he had allowed his mother to drive away. The realization hit him with brutal clarity: he had failed to protect them, just as his family had failed to honor the truth of its past. The next morning, John made a decision. He would find them. He didn't know how or where to begin, but he couldn't let fear and guilt keep him paralyzed any longer. It was a small step, but it was one he had to take for Catherine, for Lila, and for the part of himself he had lost the day they walked out of his life. Margaret, of course, would object. She had spent years ensuring that loose ends like Catherine and Lila remained firmly tied. But for the first time in a long time, John felt a spark of defiance. His mother's control had ruled his life for too long, and he was ready to break free. That night, As the mansion fell into its usual silence, John sat by the window, staring out at the sprawling gardens he had once seen as a symbol of stability. Now, they felt more like gilded chains. Somewhere out there, Catherine and Lila were building a life without him, a life he had no right to intrude upon, yet desperately longed to be a part of. He whispered into the quiet, a promise carried on the wind. "I'll find you, and I'll make this right." The small town of Middlebury, Vermont, nestled in the foothills of the Green Mountains, was a far cry from the grandeur of the Anderson estate. Its charm lay in its simplicity: wooden storefronts with peeling paint, narrow streets lined with maple trees, and a community that prided itself on familiarity. But for Catherine Miller, it was a place to disappear, a place where she could start over without the shadows of her past following too closely. Catherine's rented clapboard house leaned precariously to one side, its white paint weathered by years of neglect. Inside, the smell of coffee brewing in a dented pot mixed with the faint aroma of lavender, a scent she'd clung to since leaving the mansion. She found small comforts in the mundane, the routines of her new life keeping the weight of her past at bay. Most mornings, the sound of Lila's giggles echoed through the tiny house as Catherine braided her daughter's hair and readied her for the day. "Mama, do you think the other kids will like my ribbon?" Lila asked, holding up a yellow bow with a proud grin. Catherine crouched beside her, adjusting the bow to perfection. "They'll love it," she said, smoothing Lila's curls. "And if they don't, you'll still shine brighter than the sun." Lila giggled and wrapped her arms around her mother's neck. "I love you, Mama." Catherine held her close, her heart swelling with both pride and a pang of sadness. "I love you too, sweetheart," she whispered, "more than anything." Their mornings often began this way, full of love and quiet resilience. But as Catherine walked Lila to the small daycare a few blocks from their house, the whispers and stares of the townsfolk were a constant reminder that they were different. The locals didn't need to say much, their glances, their half-hearted smiles, spoke volumes. Lila's warm brown skin and wide, curious eyes set her apart, and Catherine knew that the judgment was as much for her daughter's difference as for Catherine herself. At the diner where Catherine worked mornings, the rhythm of clinking dishes and the hiss of the coffee machine was a welcome distraction. The regulars, farmers, factory workers, and retirees rarely tipped more than a few coins. But Catherine smiled through it all. Her apron was faded, the soles of her shoes worn, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Refill, Mrs. Carson?" she asked one of the regulars, a stern-faced woman who sat alone in the corner booth every day. Mrs. Carson nodded curtly, her eyes lingering on Catherine for a moment before flicking to the kitchen. Catherine felt the weight of the woman's gaze but didn't falter. She had learned to brush off the judgments of others long ago. Her second job at the grocery store was no less demanding. By the time Catherine clocked out in the evenings, her back ached, and her hands were raw from handling cold produce. Yet, every night when she pushed open the door to their little house and saw Lila toddling toward her, her exhaustion faded. One evening, as Catherine unpacked a small bag of groceries, Lila tugged on her hand. "Mama, can we sit on the porch? I wanna see the stars." Catherine smiled, setting aside a can of soup. "Of course. Sweet pea. Let me grab a blanket." They sat together on the creaky porch steps, Lila wrapped snugly in a knitted blanket. The sky above was a deep indigo, pinpricked with stars. The night air was cool but not unpleasant, and the gentle rustling of the trees was the only sound. "Mama," Lila began, her voice small. "Why do people look at me funny?" Catherine's breath caught. It was a question she had dreaded, one she had hoped to postpone for a few more years. She looked down at her daughter's innocent face, her wide eyes filled with curiosity rather than hurt. How could she explain prejudice to someone so young? Someone so full of life and trust? "Sweetheart," Catherine said softly, wrapping an arm around Lila. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different. It doesn't mean they're bad people, they just don't see the whole picture. Like my hair? Lila asked, tugging at one of her springy curls. Catherine chuckled softly, kissing her daughter's forehead. Your hair is beautiful. Just like the rest of you. Different doesn't mean bad, it means special. And you, my little star, are very, very special. Lila beamed at her mother's words, her worries momentarily forgotten. I'm special like the stars. Exactly, Catherine said, pulling her daughter closer. And just like the stars, you'll always shine, no matter what anyone says. The moment was bittersweet for Catherine. She wished she could shield Lila from the harsh realities of the world. But she knew that wasn't possible. All she could do was teach her daughter to hold her head high, to see her uniqueness as a strength rather than a flaw. As the evening wore on, Lila fell asleep in Catherine's arms, her tiny fingers clutching the gold necklace that Catherine always wore. It was a gift from John, a painful reminder of the life they had left behind. But tonight, as she looked at her sleeping daughter, Catherine found comfort in its weight. It was a piece of their story, a thread that connected the past to the present. Staring out at the quiet town, Catherine whispered a silent promise to herself and to Lila. No matter what happens, we'll make it through. Together. The Anderson mansion was quiet, as it always seemed to be. Its grand halls echoed faintly with the footsteps of its lone occupants. But the house itself felt like a mausoleum, preserving a legacy that John Miller no longer wanted to carry. He sat in his study, his hands clasped tightly, staring at the letter he had read countless times over the past few days. The words of his great-grandfather seemed to mock him, echoing truths that his family had buried long ago. Love transcends the boundaries of race, class, and prejudice. He ran his fingers over the faded ink, his thoughts drifting to Catherine and Lila. They were no longer abstract regrets or distant memories, they were tangible, living pieces of his life that he had abandoned. John knew he couldn't remain passive any longer. Every night, he had sat in this very chair, drinking in the solitude, letting guilt gnaw at his resolve. But tonight, he would act. He had hired investigators weeks ago, but every lead seemed to hit a wall. Margaret's influence, though she was no longer alive, still cast a long shadow, and John suspected she had ensured that no trace of Catherine or Lila could be easily found. Yet something had shifted in him. For years, he had allowed himself to be ruled by fear of losing the Anderson name, fear of defying his mother, fear of facing his own failures. But now, that fear was outweighed by something stronger, the need to make amends. He picked up the phone and dialed the investigator's number, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I need you to keep looking, he said firmly. Don't stop until you find them. No matter what it takes. Underscore 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 underscore. Catherine, unaware of the storm brewing in John's mind, continued her life in Middlebury. The diner was bustling that morning, the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation filling the air. Catherine moved between tables with practiced ease, her smile never wavering, even as her feet ached from hours of standing. Morning, Catherine, said one of the regulars, a wiry man named Hank who always ordered the same breakfast, eggs over easy with black coffee. Morning, Hank, she replied, refilling his cup. How's the farm treating you? Same as always, he grumbled, though there was a faint smile on his lips. Got a new calf last week. Lila might like to see it if you're ever free. Catherine's heart warmed at the gesture. Despite the whispers and the stares, there were kind souls in Middlebury who had embraced her and Lila. She'd love that, she said sincerely. Thanks, Hank. The bell above the diner's door jingled. and Catherine turned to see a man in a suit step inside. He looked out of place among the flannel shirts and work boots, his polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor. He approached the counter, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "Ms. Miller?" he asked, his voice measured. Catherine's smile faltered slightly, her heart skipping a beat. "Yes. I'm with a private investigation firm," he said, pulling a business card from his pocket and sliding it across the counter. "I was hired by John Miller. He's been trying to locate you and your daughter." Catherine's hand hovered over the card, her stomach twisting. She hadn't heard John's name spoken aloud in years, and the sound of it brought a flood of emotions: anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. "I'm not interested," she said, her voice cool as she pushed the card back toward him. "Tell him to stop looking." The man hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to such a firm dismissal. "Ms. Miller. Mr. Miller wants to make things right." Right. Catherine cut him off, her voice rising slightly. "Tell him it's too late for that. Lila and I don't need anything from him." The investigator opened his mouth as if to argue but thought better of it. He nodded curtly, pocketing the card, and left the diner without another word. Catherine stood frozen for a moment, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Everything okay, Catherine?" Hank asked, his brow furrowed. She forced a smile, though her hands were trembling. "Yeah, just fine. Be right back." She hurried to the kitchen, leaning against the wall as she took a shaky breath. She hadn't allowed herself to think about John for years. Not since the night she walked out of the mansion with Lila in her arms. She had built a life here, imperfect but her own, and she wasn't about to let him unravel it. But as the day wore on, her thoughts kept drifting back to the investigator's words. What did John want? Why now? She told herself it didn't matter, that she had moved on. But a small part of her, a part she tried to ignore, wondered if he truly meant to make amends. That evening, as she tucked Lila into bed, Catherine sat beside her, stroking her daughter's curls. Lila looked up at her, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Mama, are you okay?" Catherine smiled softly, pressing a kiss to Lila's forehead. "I'm fine, sweet pea. Go to sleep." As Lila's breathing evened out, Catherine sat in the dim light of the room, the gold necklace catching a faint glimmer from the bedside lamp. She turned it over in her fingers, her mind churning with memories and questions she thought she had left behind. John Miller wanted to find her. But was it because of guilt or something more? The days in Middlebury continued as usual, but Catherine couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her since the investigator's visit. She buried herself in work, hoping the hours at the diner and grocery store would drown out the questions circling her mind. Yet, every time she looked at Lila, those questions resurfaced. "Mama, do you think the stars are the same everywhere?" Lila asked one evening as they sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. Catherine glanced up at the clear Vermont sky, dotted with a million tiny lights. "I think so. Sweet pea," she said softly. "No matter where you go, they'll always be there." Lila leaned into her mother's side, her warmth anchoring Catherine in the moment. "Do you think Grandma is watching us from the stars?" Catherine's breath hitched, but she managed a smile. "I think she's watching over us every day, not just from the stars. She's proud of you, Lila." "I know she is." Lila nodded, her small fingers playing with the necklace around Catherine's neck. "And you, Mama?" Catherine pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "She'd be proud of both of us, my love." But as much as Catherine tried to focus on the present, her thoughts kept wandering back to John. She didn't want to admit it, even to herself, but part of her was curious about why he was looking for them now. What could he possibly say to undo the years of struggle? The nights she had cried herself to sleep, and the weight of raising Lila alone. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon that everything changed. Catherine was stocking shelves at the grocery store. her apron damp from carrying boxes in and out of the back room. She had just placed a row of canned goods on the shelf when she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she froze. Standing there, drenched from the rain but unmistakably familiar, was John. "Catherine," he said, his voice barely audible over the soft hum of the store. For a moment, neither of them moved. Catherine's heart raced, anger and shock flooding her veins in equal measure. She couldn't believe he was standing here, in the very life she had built away from him. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. John took a hesitant step closer, his hands raised as if to show he meant no harm. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've been trying to find you for months." "Well, you found me," Catherine snapped, her hands clenching into fists. "What do you want?" "John." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "I want to make things right," he said finally. "For you. For Lila. For all the time I let slip away." Catherine let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Make things right? Do you think you can just walk back into our lives and fix everything with an apology?" "No," John admitted, his shoulders sagging. "I know I can't undo the past. I know I failed you, both of you. But I've spent every day since you left regretting what I did. And I'm here now because I can't let it go on like this." Catherine stared at him, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. "You don't get to decide that now," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't get to show up and act like you care after all this time." John's face fell, but he didn't back down. "You're right. I don't deserve forgiveness. And I don't deserve a second chance. But I'm asking for one anyway, not for my sake, but for Lila's. She deserves to know her father." The mention of Lila struck a nerve, and Catherine's resolve wavered. She wanted to protect her daughter from the pain John had caused. But she also knew that Lila had questions she couldn't answer, questions about her family, her identity, and the father she had never known. "She doesn't need you," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's strong. She's happy. We've made a life without you." "I know," John said, his voice breaking. "And I'm so proud of you for that. But I want to be part of her life. If you'll let me, I want to give her what I should have given her from the start." Catherine turned away, her chest heaving with the weight of it all. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he had no right to show up now. But when she thought of Lila, she hesitated. Did she have the right to deny her daughter a chance to know her father? "Leave," she said finally, her voice cold. "You don't get to make this decision. I need time to think." John nodded, his face etched with pain. "I'll give you all the time you need," he said softly, "but I won't stop trying." "Catherine." "Not this time." As he walked out into the rain, Catherine leaned against the shelf, her head in her hands. The weight of his presence lingered, pulling at her carefully constructed walls. She didn't know what to think. But one thing was certain, everything had just changed. That evening, as she sat by Lila's bedside, watching her daughter sleep, Catherine held the gold necklace tightly in her hand. She had spent so long protecting Lila from the past. But now, the past had found them, and she wasn't sure what to do next. The rain continued to fall through the night, a steady rhythm against the windows of Catherine's little house. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea in front of her, her thoughts as turbulent as the storm outside. Lila was asleep in the next room, her soft snores a comforting reminder of the life Catherine had built for them, a life that now felt fragile, as though one wrong move could shatter it. John's words replayed in her mind. She wanted to dismiss them as too little, too late, but the sincerity in his voice lingered, unsettling her resolve. He had looked older, worn down by guilt and time. But could she trust him? Could she let him into Lila's life after all these years? The next morning, the storm had passed, but the clouds still hung low over Middlebury. Catherine tried to carry on as usual, dropping Lila off at daycare and heading to the diner for her morning shift. The regulars greeted her with their usual nods and grunts, and the clatter of dishes provided a comforting backdrop. Yet, she felt disconnected, as though she were watching her life from the outside. "Morning, Catherine," Hank said as she refilled his coffee. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink." She forced a smile. "Just a lot on my mind, Hank." He raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he handed her a small bag of homemade cookies. "For Lila," he said gruffly. "That kid's got a sweet tooth, doesn't she?" Catherine's smile became genuine. "She'll love these. Thanks, Hank." The kindness of people like Hank reminded her of the community she had found in Middlebury. But it also highlighted the loneliness she had carried for years. As much as she loved her daughter and the life they had built, there was a part of her that had never stopped feeling abandoned by John, by his family, and by the world that seemed to judge her for her choices. That afternoon, she took a walk to clear her head, her feet carrying her to the small park where she often sat with Lila. The benches were still damp from the rain, but she didn't care. She sank onto one, staring out at the empty playground, her thoughts swirling. She had spent so long being angry at John for his betrayal, at herself for believing in him, and at the world for making her fight so hard just to survive. But as she sat there, she realized that her anger had become a shield, protecting her from the deeper pain of loss. Letting John back into her life, even in a small way, meant lowering that shield. It meant risking more hurt. "Mama." The sound of Lila's voice jolted Catherine from her thoughts. She turned to see her daughter running toward her, her curls bouncing with every step. Behind her, the daycare worker waved, smiling as Lila barreled into Catherine's arms. "Sweet pea, what are you doing here?" Catherine asked, hugging her tightly. "Miss Clara said you came to the park, so she let me come find you," Lila said, her face lighting up. "Can we stay for a while?" Catherine hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Go play. But stay where I can see you." Lila ran off to the swings, her laughter echoing through the park. Catherine watched her, her heart aching with love and uncertainty. Lila deserved the world, and Catherine had done everything she could to give it to her. But was that enough? Could she give Lila the answers she would inevitably seek about her father? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, her body tensing when she saw John approaching. He looked hesitant, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. "I'm not here to push," he said quickly, as if sensing her unease. "I just wanted to see you. And to apologize. Again." Catherine folded her arms, her gaze steady. "You've said you're sorry, John. What do you want me to do with that?" He hesitated, then sat on the edge of the bench, keeping some distance between them. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to be honest with you, Catherine. I let my mother's judgment cloud everything. I let fear make decisions for me, and I hate myself for that." She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "You think that changes anything? You think you can walk in here and erase what you did?" "No," he said, his voice firm. "I can't erase it. But I can try to make up for it. For Lila. She deserves to know where she comes from. She deserves to know she's loved." Catherine's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't have the right to speak about Lila like that. But deep down, she knew he was right. Lila had started asking questions, and Catherine didn't have all the answers. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand," John said, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then, Lila's laughter broke through the tension, and Catherine's gaze softened as she watched her daughter play. "She's everything to me," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "If you hurt her, I won't," John said. his voice steady. I promise. Catherine didn't answer. But she didn't tell him to leave. Either. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a start. The following days passed in a strange limbo. Catherine didn't invite John into their lives. But she didn't shut him out. Either. He began to appear more frequently in small, unobtrusive ways, offering to walk Lila home from daycare or stopping by the diner with a quiet hello. Each time, Catherine's emotions churned with uncertainty. But Lila's joy at these encounters made it harder to push him away. Who is he? Mama, Lila asked one evening as they sat together on the couch, her small fingers tracing the necklace around Catherine's neck. Catherine hesitated, the words catching in her throat. He's someone from my past, she said carefully. Someone who wants to know you. Do you like him? Lila tilted her head, her innocent eyes searching Catherine's face. Catherine gave a small, weary smile. I don't know. Sweet pea. But what matters is how you feel. Do you like him? Lila nodded enthusiastically. He's nice. He tells funny stories. Catherine's heart twisted at the simplicity of her daughter's answer. For Lila, the world was still uncomplicated, filled with trust and curiosity. Catherine wanted to protect that innocence. But she also wondered if allowing John to stay might fill a gap that neither of them had fully acknowledged. Underscore 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 underscore. One sunny afternoon, John suggested a trip to the local park. Lila practically leapt at the idea, tugging at Catherine's hand until she agreed. They packed a small picnic and headed out, Lila skipping ahead while John and Catherine followed at a slower pace. Thank you for letting me spend time with her, John said softly, his gaze fixed on Lila as she ran toward the swings. I know I don't deserve it. Catherine sighed, her eyes on her daughter. It's not about you, John. It's about her. She's curious. And she's happy when you're around. I won't take that from her. They reached the swings. And John lifted Lila into one, pushing her gently as her laughter rang out. Catherine watched them, her emotions a tangled knot. Seeing them together was both heartwarming and painful. A reminder of what could have been and what still might be. After the swings, they spread a blanket under a tree and unpacked the picnic. Lila chattered excitedly, recounting stories from daycare while John listened intently, his expression soft and attentive. For a moment, Catherine allowed herself to imagine this as their normal family picnics. Shared laughter, and the warmth of togetherness. But the weight of the past was never far away. Why did you come back now? She asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the light-hearted conversation. John looked at her, his face serious. Because I couldn't stay away any longer. I've spent years regretting what I did, what I didn't do. Losing you and Lila was the worst mistake of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to make things right. Catherine's gaze hardened. You think you can fix this with words? With a few picnics and promises? No, John admitted. I don't think I can fix it at all. But I can try to be there now. I can try to show you and Lila that I'm not the same man I was back then. Lila, oblivious to the tension, ran to them with a handful of flowers she had picked. Look. Mama, aren't they pretty? Catherine smiled, taking the flowers and holding them to her nose. They're beautiful. Sweet pea. Thank you. Lila turned to John, holding out a small daisy. This one's for you. John took the flower, his eyes glistening as he thanked her. Catherine watched the exchange, her heart softening despite herself. Lila's generosity, her willingness to accept John so easily, reminded Catherine of the innocence they both stood to lose if this didn't work out. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they packed up and headed home, Lila held John's hand on one side and Catherine's on the other, her laughter filling the space between them. For a fleeting moment, Catherine allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. Underscore 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 underscore. That evening, after Lila had gone to bed, Catherine found herself sitting on the porch with John. The cool night air wrapped around them, and the faint hum of crickets filled the silence. "She's incredible," John said, breaking the quiet. "You've done such an amazing job raising her." Catherine glanced at him, her expression guarded. "I did it without you." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'll never stop being sorry for that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Catherine stared out at the darkened street, her thoughts racing. Finally, she turned to him. "If you're serious about being in her life, you need to prove it. This isn't just about showing up when it's convenient. She needs stability. She needs someone she can rely on." John nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes, Catherine. I won't let her down again." Catherine studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity. She didn't want to trust him, didn't want to open herself or Lila to more pain. But for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't before, a quiet resolve, an understanding of the responsibility he had abandoned and was now desperate to reclaim. "We'll see," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not making any promises." John nodded again, his expression serious. "Thank you." As he left, Catherine sat alone on the porch, the gold necklace glinting faintly in the moonlight. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile and uncertain, but there nonetheless. As the sun set over Middlebury, a warm glow bathed the small house where Catherine and Lila sat together on the porch. Inside, John quietly prepared dinner, the soft hum of his voice as he hummed to himself drifting out through the open window. It was a scene of quiet togetherness, a moment of peace that spoke of new beginnings. Catherine looked down at Lila, who was tracing the gold necklace around her neck. "Mama," Lila asked, her voice filled with curiosity, "do you think families can find each other, even after they've been apart?" Catherine smiled, her heart swelling with the complexity of emotions she had carried for so long. "I think families can always find their way back. Sweet pea. It just takes time and love." Lila nodded thoughtfully before leaning her head against her mother's shoulder. In that moment, Catherine realized that while the past would always be a part of their story, it didn't have to define their future. Together, they had begun to rebuild, not perfectly, but honestly. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt journeys. Share your own story in the comments below, we'd love to hear from you. See you in our next inspiring video.